astounded by some parallels. They won't be very nice parallels. When you hear about some of the ignoble things that were done to our last hero, George Whitefield. The amount of envy that this man provoked in others, it was absolutely ugly.
Remarkable man.
Yeah, that's right. He was not ugly. He was high and hallowed in his work. Stig Medby is a retired businessman, but he's not very retired. We have made him into being a library on legs. He has done a countless number of biographies and book reviews, and it is really a privilege to introduce him as well. We had three busy men who came here with tired minds tonight after full days of work. So Stig, tell us about the incredible George Whitefield, would you?
I will do that. The review tonight is based on the small book again, Leaders in Actions. These are excellent books, very easy to read, very fast reads, but full of information. George Whitefield is an individual that if you'd asked me 3 or 4 years ago, and it's spelled W-H-I-T-E, field, but it's pronounced Whitefield, not Whitefield. If you'd asked me a few years ago who this man was, I'd tell you, I don't have a clue. I've never heard of this guy. And it's kind of a shame that we go through our lives and we're not taught about Jonathan Edwards, or we're not taught the other side of Sebastian Bach or Whitefield. But this evening, we're going to have a very interesting review of this man. In writing my talking points to start off here, some of the defining traits, I'm going to use one of the slides that we just saw here on the 4 C's. Convicted. This man was vertically connected to God, absolutely and unequivocally. Convicted to be Christ-like at all times, not just when he's on the pulpit, but his entire life and everything that he did and everyone he talked to. Committed in his heart and his mind to his convictions, and boy, did this man live a life that you're going to be kind of shocked to hear. Courage. One of the definitions we had of courage was to conquer fear. The definition that I prefer to apply to Whitefield this evening is one that John gave me, and it's moving forward when you don't know what comes next. I think that's just an excellent way to define courage. This man stepped forward into an environment that was brutal, to say the very least. He had no idea what was going to come next, but we're going to see how God used this man in an unbelievable way. Main study areas. If you would, I want you to kind of step out of your life when you're listening to this, okay? You step out of your personal life, your work life, the societal life that you live in, step into the world of George Whitefield. Keeping, of course, your perspective from where you currently are. We're going to look at his personal life. How did he live it and what were his challenges? We're going to look at his work, ministry life. We all have personal life, work life. What were the impediments? What were the roadblocks there to him? And we're going to look at Whitefield, and this is really important within the context of the times that he lived. It's going to be shocking to you, I think, to hear what was going on in society at this time. It certainly was to me. 2 distinctions. We talk about revival and reformation. We're going to talk about revival here, which is all about getting men and women saved, getting men and women into heaven, and this is what George was all about, versus what a reformation is, and that brings out an ethical crisis in the nation that is culture changing. So having said that, let's look at a man in black and white, as Steve said, and of course he was in black and white, a black robe with white highlights on it. I'll pass that around, had the wig. He was definitely a man of his time. He was America's first celebrity, although he was born in England and preached in England. He also preached significantly and very importantly in America. And he first began touring America in 1738. He was often ridiculed, scorned, persecuted for his faith. And listen to this. Enduring twice being clubbed, once stoned, beaten 6 times, and whipped 6 times more, he was opposed not just by the profane, but by the religious establishment and the clergy. Talk about a work life, huh? He had great physical courage. He sparked the Great Awakening in America in the 1740s and laid the foundation for the American Republic. Among his great admirers are people which are common to you, George Washington and Patrick Henry. Let's take a look at the England of Mr. Whitefield. England at this time wasn't the shining star of Christendom. You know, at one time in my life, I actually believed that Christianity built upon itself, you know, and got more and more powerful and more knowledgeable, and more people would come to Christianity based on how people were living their lives, and this was not the case in this era. In 1662, England was falling and falling hard. She'd ejected more than 2,000 Puritan ministers from their pulpits. Rationalism and deism had taken their toll. The Bible became a collection of myths, and God an absentee landlord. What a thing to say. Prosperity was everywhere. Interesting, huh? Entangling the soul with materialism, cynicism ruled as spiritual darkness spread. Sounds a little bit like today. Prime Minister, this is the leadership, huh? Think of our leadership today. Prime Minister Robert Walpole, at the deathbed of Queen Caroline in 1739, both of these people were atheists, suggested that the Archbishop be called, noting, and this is a quote, that it would satisfy the good wise fools, that's the people in this room, Christians, who will call us atheists if we don't profess to be as great fools as they are, end quote. That's the leadership of England. As faith went, so went morals. Vice ruled the day. Depravity had become the fashion, corruption the popular rage. In 1689, the Parliament forbade the importation of gin, starting the gin craze. Every sixth house in London brewed their own gin. Let me say that again. Every sixth house in London brewed their own gin. Signs appeared that said, quote, drunk for a penny, dead drunk for 2 pence, clean straw for nothing, end quote. Bad times. Listen to this. This is one that shocked me. King George II even found it necessary to remind the Archbishop of Canterbury, the head of the Church of England, that his residence was not intended for gambling and whores. Can you believe that? This was the England of George Whitefield, this incredible godly hero that we're going to talk about. Where was deliverance to be found? It came from a fatherless boy laughingly named for the king of the realm, who called himself, this is what George, how he referred to himself, a worm taken from a public house. He was born December 16, 1714, to Elizabeth and Thomas Whitefield in Gloucester, England. He was their seventh child. His father had died 2 years later in 1716 at the age of 35. George's youth was tumultuous. He fought in the streets. We don't think of our godly heroes as fighting in the streets, do we? He fought in the streets and associated with the wrong types of people, all while his mother, to help with an inn she now ran alone, entered into a disastrous marriage. George had no money, no outlook for an income, so he resigned himself to a life of a tradesman. So we're going to see how God takes George and moves George forward. In 1732, at the age of 18, Whitefield enters Oxford University, again, very young. And how did he enter Oxford? How did he get in? He didn't have money. So he worked as a servitor. What's a servitor? Well, a servitor is an individual that does the laundry, serve food, and clean the rooms of wealthy students. He obviously learned how to do that in his mother's inn, right? He learned how to clean and serve food and cook and probably a lot more other things. This was not below him to do that. It was at Oxford that George, whose health and soul were tormented as he tried with all his might to live a perfect life in God, that he found freedom in Jesus Christ through his rebirth. He was now free. Very important point in this man's life. He was a young guy at 18, and he virtually, I think, that this period in his life, it impacted the rest of his life. He died relatively young at 56 years old. He starved himself. He went through this incredible regimen of trying to become the perfect individual before God. He left Oxford for about 9 months. He was physically worn out after all of these self-imposed trials, completely broke. He was aflame with the Spirit as he read the Bible daily on his knees. We hear that a lot today, don't we? Read the Bible daily. Read the Bible daily. And now we're starting to hear, how do you read the Bible? I read it on my knees in reverence for God. God was breathing through every page he read. Everything seemed new. He now wanted everyone to know about how God had enlightened his soul. Incredible man. In 1736, George graduates from Oxford and was ordained as a deacon in the Anglican Church. 1736, he was born in 14. You can do the math, still a very young man. 1 week later, he preaches his first sermon to 300 of his closest friends, family, and clergymen. 300? I don't know if I could get 30. 300, you know? It was obvious George was a powerful and gifted speaker, so much so that his friend Thomas Broughton asked George to speak for him for a season, which was 2 months in the chapel at the Tower of London. This was really an important milestone because these were hard and challenging people to preach before, were the individuals in London. It was in 1737 that George received a letter from John Wesley asking him to come to Georgia. The letter speaks of the work in Georgia. This is not the Georgia that was in the former Soviet Union, of course. This is the American Georgia. And his fields of harvest that awaited the bold and the willing. So now, all of a sudden, the life that had been his in England, he's now going to change a little bit, and he's going to go to America. The power of God attended the word. Hearts melted, sinners repented, and masses thronged his meetings. People came to see him from every denomination, social class, and profession. Think about now how he's rising, right? He's out of Oxford. This man is rising in the word. He's rising in his confidence and his conviction. He's becoming an individual that others are looking up to and listening to in England. In December of 1737, with the fire revival raging in England, George sets out for the tiny village of Dummer in Georgia. George Whitefield had been ordained barely 18 months. In 1738, he arrives in Georgia to find ministerial devastation. You notice the quotes there? Left by a not as of yet born again John Wesley, who left in disgrace and under indictment for a love affair he had with the chief magistrate's daughter. So here George Whitefield is invited to Georgia in America. He comes to America expecting that, well, you know what? These people are going to show me the ropes. I'll know exactly what I'm going to do. Wesley's gone, and all of a sudden there's this big scandal right there. You can imagine one of the individuals that had invited him was now in disgrace. What do you think these people thought of an unknown George Whitefield? Georgia was founded as a debtor's colony, was swarming with orphans who had been abandoned by parents who fled from all of their commitments, including their children. Pretty brutal comment, but then we understand what's going on in the world at this time. He vowed to build an orphanage, and he returned to England in August of 38. England had changed in George's absence. John and Charles Wesley found rebirth and had become leaders in the revival George had started, yet there was now great opposition to his message by leading clergymen who claimed he was unstable, extreme, and arrogant. Think of your work life, guys. Think of you stepping out and having people say that you were unstable, extreme, and arrogant. I mean, if you look at how things are progressing in his life, it's pretty brutal. Worse yet, pamphlets were circulating calling Whitefield a peddler of strange doctrines and a menace to the order of the church. George remarked that opposition, quote, brings me nearer to my master, end quote. As the pulpits of England rapidly closed to him, very important point here, this is going to be a transition in his life. As the pulpits of England rapidly closed to him, he came up with his mad notion to preach to the most feared of all Englishmen, the coal miners and their families. These were the dregs of humanity, guys. The dregs of humanity. Their depravity was legendary. They lived in shacks, were reputed to be gin devils, wife beaters, sodomites, and thieves. No arts, no society, and a continual fear of danger and violent death surround them. That pretty much says it like it is, doesn't it? So this is the England that he's come back to from Georgia. He's coming back to England, and all of a sudden, who he was is now being challenged at all levels. He's shut out of the pulpits in England. So what does he do? On Saturday, the 17th of February in 1739, George Whitefield in wig and robe with his prayer book began preaching to them from a little hill in Kingswood, England. New paradigm, never been done before. The ministry in England, they taught in Greek, they taught in Latin, they taught in French. Some of them would sit there and be very rote in exactly what they said. Often the people that were in there didn't understand what was being said. And when they came out, were they energized in many other situations to become godly people? No. This was really a big changer here, guys. The crowd gathered around him as most had never seen a preacher before. Interesting. Never seen a preacher before? Soon many of the blackened faces were white-streaked. Their hearts had melted before the word. Soon the whole nation marveled at the works of God amongst the hardest hearts of the land. Whitefield was now a changed man, claiming, quote, "My preaching in the fields may displease some timorous, bigoted men, but I am thoroughly persuaded it pleases God, and why should I fear anything else?" End quote. Whoa. Powerful, powerful. The clergy raged anew, yet no longer were hundreds coming to see him, but thousands. Interesting. So, we haven't gotten into his personal life yet, but we certainly know that his work life is brutal. On Sunday, the 25th of March, more than 23,000 people gathered to hear him preach. Whitefield was never the same again. Over the summer of 1739, Whitefield preached to somewhere between, are you ready? 800,000 and 1 million people. And keep in mind, this was in an era of no radio, no TV, no internet, no telephone, no newspaper that you go down to the 7-Eleven and pick up. It just wasn't there. He preached over that summer to an estimated 800,000 to 1 million people, more than in the entire history of England. I'd like to, we may not get through all of this because of time, but I want to read to you out of the book a prayer that George often said when he was in the pulpit, and I love this prayer. The prayer goes like this. "Father Abraham," he cries, "whom have you in heaven? Any Episcopalians? No. Any Presbyterians? No. Any Independents or Seceders, Newsiders or Oldsiders? Any Methodists?" And Whitefield was considered to be a Methodist. "No, no, no. Whom have you there then, Father Abraham? We don't know those names here. All who are here are Christians, believers in Christ, men who have overcome by the blood of the Lamb and the word of his testimony." This is one of the things I love about this guy. He goes into the hills in his black robe and probably powdered up too, and he preaches to the dregs of humanity. He doesn't care whether you're a Presbyterian or a Methodist. He just doesn't care. He knows that you are God's creation, and as God's creation, then it's his job to glorify God by bringing you and saving you all. What an incredible statement that is in there. I absolutely love this guy. Never ever heard of this guy before. He at this time began his lifelong practice of preach and return. He'd plow the ground and sow the seed of the word, returning to take, two important steps. One, forming the masses into small groups to mature Christian growth. So he had a plan all along. And raise a vision for some good work, which the people were encouraged to support, thus transforming society by the power and the truth of God's kingdom. Let's go on. Oh, he's now in America. He traveled by horseback 178 miles in 8 days, preaching 2 sermons every day. We talked about the work ethic of Jonathan Edwards and others who said, hey, it's very important that I have a very solid work ethic, that I actually am able to produce in life. This is George Whitefield. It's now February of 1741, and George had returned to England again, finding himself now in a firestone. Not only had letters in which he had attacked a famous archbishop, and I want to stop. I'm wondering if that's the same archbishop that the king had sent a letter to about how he was running his life in Canterbury. It doesn't say in the book, but it's interesting. So a letter that George had written to this archbishop had leaked to the press, and Wesley was attacking his belief system. Whitefield responded powerfully, but congregations had split, church doors slammed shut, and believers parted company forever. Whitefield commented that many of his converts sent, quote, threatening letters that God will speedily destroy me, end quote, heckling became violent. He wrote, quote, "I was honored with having a few stones, dirt, rotten eggs, and pieces of dead cats thrown at me," end quote. Can you imagine? Can you imagine? He was beaten at one meeting, while at others a man tried to stab him to death. Drummers were hired to drown him out. Can you imagine? I don't like George Whitefield. You know, I'm going to hire Steve, and Steve's going to bring his band over there, and the drummers are going to sit there and drum it out as George is talking. Can you imagine how vile this is? Were hired to drown him out. A man urinated on him, and cattle were driven through the attendees. Heated opposition attended him the rest of his life. And this is a guy that is a hero of God. I mean, it's remarkable. Whitefield marries Elizabeth James on the 8th of February of 1744. His son dies at the age of 4 months. He consolidated his wife, buried his son, and returned to preaching, stating, quote, "Weeping must not hinder saving." You talk about strength. The Whitefields left for America. Again, in 1744, George's health was now troubling him, vomiting blood and suffering horrible pains of angina. But the revival had taken hold in America, changing the colonies by bringing them together and giving them all a common vision. It also states in here about his preaching to the ruling class, the rich classes of England. At that time, they thought, well, you know, I have money. I have a lot of money, and therefore God has blessed me and God favors me. Dale doesn't have much money. He's just part of the masses over there. Therefore, you know, he is not in God's favor. This is how these people thought. And they needed a Whitefield to come into their lives to bring these classes together, which he did. His message was powerful at all levels of society, and it was a very, very class-based society at that time. He became an astonishingly successful author and publisher. People were trying to build monuments to him and his work. He responded many times, "No, let the name of Whitefield die so that the cause of Jesus Christ may live." He played a hugely important role in the unification of the colonial thought and action. He often spoke of liberty merging political and spiritual themes in his sermons. It was a responsibility of both the church and state to preserve liberty. Interesting considering what you hear today, isn't it? He accompanied Franklin before the Parliament to air colonial grievances. You talk about courage, huh? So here are these hillbillies in America, right? A couple of cities on the coasts. Inland, they're living in cabins and in patches of dirt, right? And here is Benjamin Franklin. He goes with Benjamin Franklin to air colonial grievances. He helped colonists envision a new kind of government, one distinct from the church in function, but equally given to the cause of true faith. In 1770, he was 56 years old, but worn out beyond his years. His health was bad. He could barely walk and slept little, but still the power of the word was with him. At 6 a.m. on September 30th of 1770, George Whitefield dies and is buried in the land he now calls home, Newburyport, Massachusetts. That's kind of part one. I don't have much time left for the second half, which are his character issues. And when you go the hallmarks of God's chosen heroes, you're going to find this second half is a really important read for everyone in here. I can touch on a few. Action. There is not a thing on the face of the earth that I abhor so much as idleness or idle people. Interesting, isn't it? When we talk about God's heroes, these guys work. They work hard. Spiritual discipline. He organized his time and followed it without deviation. He lived a life of moderation and simplicity. He lived most of the 34 years of his ministry in rented homes or as a guest of strangers. There's a comment in here about giving. His married life wasn't as successful as it probably could have been. One of the issues is that he gave away all of his furniture in the house to a needy individual. And of course, that doesn't endear you with your wife. So when your wife comes home and there's no furniture in the house, right? So there are some issues with this man. You know, you came to him, he would give you the shirt off his back, literally. Unity. He welcomed all believers even when they did not welcome themselves. Great point, right? Remember his Father Abraham prayer? We don't know those names. There are only Christians here. even when they did not welcome themselves, always focusing on salvation in one Lord and one faith. Suffering, he believed that sanctified afflictions are signs of special love of God, and lived his life knowing that trials come before blessings. His whole life, trials come before blessings. And boy, did he plow through those trials. Intercession, he was a man completely given to prayer. And we've talked so much of that in the Heroes class that Dale presented on. It's all about prayer, daily prayer, this vertical conviction that you have with God Almighty. His life was a life of constant communion with God. We can go on here. I'll give you a couple more, and then I'll stop. He understood that men didn't read the Bible. There was a lot of illiteracy, right? That people barely read the Bible, and there were very few that read it all the way through, and they weren't necessarily taught, as we know in the pulpits in England at that time, to read the Bible. So he used the Word of God as a very powerful tool to bring people to God, to get them engaged in understanding the Bible and how they should live their lives. He made mistakes almost all in public. I love that one. Almost all in public. They were echoed in the press and through his jeering enemies. He taught his generation that money is a tool and that generosity is the coin of the kingdom of God. I mean, it goes on and on. I'll just pick one more in here randomly. Knowledge. In Whitfield's day, it was killing the church. Knowledge apart from faith. Religion of mind disconnected from the heart. It left congregations dead, ministers proud, and nations unchecked. Kind of in support. And I told you a little fib. The last one will be in humor. An opposing clergyman said to him one time, this is his work life again, "I'm sorry to have you here." George responds, "So is the devil." Powerful men. Yeah, this is a wonderful man. He fits right in with Steve and Dale's presentation this evening. He's a man of God, an incredible man. When you look at him and you look at his characteristics and every one of these hallmarks that I was reading through on the sheet John gave us, this is another classic example of an individual. He had no stop mechanism, none. He understood exactly what he needed to do, and he went out and did it. Thank you.
Were you men aware that Whitfield, for all of his back and forth trips between Britain and America, is known in history as the father of American independence? Now, we know from what you said that he took the trip to England with Franklin to state our case. But it's incredible to realize that this man had a heart for our country as well.